Hi, I'm Marcel, and welcome to me screaming into the void, mostly about books. I am doing almost reading through time with my sort of own little twist because I'm weirdly complicated like that. So her project is that she reads a book from each century and a book from one decade each month, going both forward and backwards. And while she's doing like the average 1100s to 2000s, I'm doing all the way back until ancient times. So I'm both following her sort of directions and my own little directions, and we'll meet in the middle. So for March, she had the project of reading a book from the 19th century. And there I read the book, The Idiot by Dostoevsky. And this is a book about a man who is very noble, thinks of himself as very noble. And we have these ideals and we need to follow them. And why can't the world just do what we have agreed that we should be doing? And that's sort of the aspect of the title. Is he the idiot for having these ideals, for thinking that the world should have these ideals, for not accepting that the world doesn't have the same ideals that he has? Or is he sort of the only sane person in an idiotic world? So Dostoevsky was very, very focused on religion, probably not surprising. And he sort of used a lot of his sort of religious writing, not in a theological sense, but in an ethical sense. In a lot of his other books, not just this one, you can see that he has a focus on what is the right way to live your life, inspired by his own ethics, but also exploring that. And that, in a sense, is one of the things that he is exploring here. What do you do when your ethics doesn't really line up with everyone else? When you can be abused, in a sense, because you have this sort of moral compass that no one else is following. And is that necessarily a good or bad thing? It is easy to be mean to kind people because kind people want to be kind. If you're asking them to do something and they can help, they will most likely be willing to help. And this is a good thing. Our society needs us to help one another. Our biology needs us to both receive help and be able to give help. But it also is a very easy system to abuse if you aren't thinking about anything else but yourself. And I really like the fact that Dostoevsky doesn't really shy away from that he is sort of honest and open about the fact that having morals in a world where that isn't sort of the guiding principle of the larger society isn't easy. You will feel like an idiot. But does that mean that you shouldn't? Something to think about. And on the other hand of the spectre, we have in March read books for 200th century before BC and 100th century BC. So for a book written 200th century BC, I read the Bhagavata, which is a part of the Mahabharata. I'm used to talking about these things in Norwegian. And the Mahabharata is a larger epic that is a very important text within the Hindu religion. This is just one of 3 books to show you how large that epic is. And the Bhagavad Gita is one sort of part of this larger epic. And what that book is about is that you have this warrior king that is going into this war. This is about a war. And he loses his memory, he loses himself, he doesn't know where it is, and then he finds Krishna, the god Krishna. And he then starts having a conversation with Krishna about what is the right way to live your life. And what Krishna sort of points out, this is one of the things where he talks, for example, about Dharma, where he talks about relinquishing your needs. That if you want to live a good life, you need to stop really having needs, to release them, which is a very big part of the Hinduistic religion, about sort of not having so many needs, in a sense. And what does that mean? How can you then interpret that? But he also talks a lot about your role in society and your duty, in a sense, to act, to not sort of pull back and sort of, I'm just going to wander around until I do not exist anymore, which was ascetics did kind of that, which was a kind of monk at the time. And he sort of says, no, you have a duty to go into society and fill the role that you have in your society, and that every role in society has its place and is important. So it is a way of sort of saying that in India, you of course have the caste system, which is you're born into a caste, you're born into a role, you're born into a place in society. And the Bhagavad Gita sort of, yes, this is a way of organizing it, but that is because every part of that is important. Every part of that, every caste has its role, and that role is important for society to exist. And that is, of course, a part of religious texts. What does this mean? How do we interpret this? What does this mean in our modern days? And there is sort of a lot of fun, interesting ways that you can work with religious texts to both try to understand the text itself, Hinduism as a religion, India as a culture, but also in the sense that what can we sort of work with when we are meeting one another? In our multicultural society, how can we interact in a way where everyone can find a place? And I think that knowing religious texts like the Bhagavad Gita helps us in that conversation. And for the book I read that was written 100th century BC, I read Gaius Julius Caesar, The Gallic War, which is a text that Caesar wrote, dictated to someone else to write for him. If he had a Goth author, that's a thing. But it's about the War of the Gauls. So the Gauls were a group of people that lived around northern France. Was there any place else? No, and it talks about the Gauls are northern France, and then you have Brittany, which is Britain, and the Germans, the Germansk. which is, of course, where in a part of Germany now. So what he does here is sort of writing almost like a travel text about traveling around and conquering these areas as a part of the Roman Empire, and then being a part of the Roman Empire, and how these sort of different groups are. So it's a way of explaining to people in Rome, what do we mean with the Gauls? What do we mean with the Germanic culture? What do we mean with Brittany? So this is an interesting text in the sense of understanding the Roman Empire, not necessarily just as war, but the ideals that were working in this place, the worldview that was a part of this place. And what I actually enjoyed was how much sort of Julius Caesar had surprisingly positive things to say in all of these we are better than everyone else worldview that he has. So he talks about how these are strong soldiers, they work in this and this way, maybe we should take some inspiration, without sort of moving away from Roman number one. And I think that's one of the things I enjoy sort of with reading texts that are this far back, that it gives you a way of understanding that history isn't just war, or that war isn't just killing. It's also very much driven and influenced by a worldview, by a way of looking at one another. So that was the books I read for the century aspect of it, but we also have a decades challenge. And in March, we are in the 1930s. And I have an aspect of the challenge where I've decided that for this decade, I am going to read one book from the Americas, one book from Asia, one book from Africa, one book from Europe, and one book from Oceania. And what was funny with the 1930s is that at least two of the books had the theme of let's try to look at history from a different point of view, written by Black authors. So the first book I read was The Black Jacobin, which is written by C.L.R. James, who is a Trinidadian author and historian. And he wanted to write a book about the Haiti Rebellion, which is a rebellion that happened on Haiti that created the first modern Black republic that we know of. That was sort of free. That was a free state. That wasn't a colony. And what C.L.R. James wanted to do, he writes about this in his introduction, is that I wanted to tell a story about Black people that wasn't just Black people being treated badly. So this is a nonfiction book, and he talks about Haiti when it was a colony with France, and about how the gradually changings that was happening in Haiti that led to the Haiti Rebellion being possible. And this includes both how more and more white people came to Haiti, which caused more and more tension between the colored population that was slaves for the most part, but not all of them, because you also had a lot of free people that were colored, and the new white people that were coming, that were tradesmen, that were artists. So they weren't rich landowners. So it became a conflict due to that, and then because this became a conflict, you also then had certain things that created more and more free men among the colored, who were then working, gathered up money, and sent their children to France to get educated. And I think that is the thing about the book that I enjoy the most, reading about the connections between their children being educated in France and taking those ideas back. Because the Haiti rebellion happened between 17... give me a moment and I'll just check the date. 1791 and 18... why are my notes so small? 1791 and 1804. That's the Haiti rebellion. But this is also the time when you have the sort of the main rebellion in France. And also, very shortly before this, we had the American rebellion. So before the Haiti rebellion, and we know that a lot of Americans around the American Revolution traveled to France and got inspiration from everything that was happening in France. So you have this sort of aspect and discussions happening in France that people from Haiti were getting access to. Black people in Haiti was getting access to because their parents were sending them to France to get educated. And so you're having these sort of these trends and these movements that were happening in France that influenced more than just the French Revolution. So I thought that was I liked it. and that's not the only thing. That was just a small part of the book. But I enjoyed to sort of see how there is so many small details that are happening one after the other that leads to the Haiti rebellion. And in South Africa, Saul Plaatje is writing a book called Mhudi. And this is a fiction book, but it's a fiction book that tries to retell a story and a part of African history from a non-white perspective. So, and I'm going to need my notes here to get all of the historical details ready. So, the book is centered around the Battle of Mosega, which was happening in the areas around South Africa and Lesotho. And we are following Mhudi, who the book is named for, and what would later become her husband, Rataga. So these are... so there is a lot of conflicts between different African tribes within this area. And Mhudi and Rataga become sort of the sole survivors, one of the few survivors from certain attacks from different tribes. And they meet and they fall in love and they travel around to try and find a place to survive in this very hostile time, which again then leads to this Battle of Mosega. And what Saul Plaatje does is, yes, there is war, yes, there is conflict, But a lot of the book is centered around women, both Mhudi and, of course, also, and I say, of course, as if this is common knowledge, but also a young wife called Umnandi. So this, she is the wife of the chief. Umnandi is the wife of the chief that Mhudi and Rataga end up with at some point, and they become very good friends. And I enjoyed how, yes, there is conflict. Yes, there is war. Yes, people don't really like one another. But by centering it on Mhudi, centering it on her relationships with her husband, with Umnandi, centering that the culture that we are trying to preserve is very often the culture created by women. It's the food, it's the beer drinking, interestingly enough. It's the way that the women are acting and keeping alive this culture, sort of in contrast to men who try to destroy it. And what he then does, he focuses then a lot on the small human moments, not the big wars. And it almost seems like he is trying to say that these are the important moments. These are the moments that we don't talk about in history. And these are the moments that aren't seen as worthy, especially considering that sort of a lot of the history that he is putting his story in has been written by white men and focus on war. And by focusing on the small moments, the relationships, it almost feels like he is saying that these are the things that make us human and important, not the wars. Still focusing on war, we are in Europe, and we've read the book Travel in Moonlight by Antal, Szerb. So I asked my husband after, because he has also read it, and I realized that he and I have two very different readings of this book. So my reading of this book, this is about a bourgeois man who travels around in Europe and tries to come to terms with that the background that he grew up with, the culture that he was socialized into, the nostalgia that he has to his own history isn't really appropriate for the world that he is living in. That he is trying to sort of figuring out what is the right way to do now that all of these old values aren't really usable anymore, in lack of a better term. And to me, it was difficult to not think about the First World War. It was still someone, Antal Szerb would have been quite young during the First World War. And sort of growing up, we know that there came so many changes after the First World War in Europe and in the European setting and the European culture, because that's just what large wars do to you. In addition to the fact that one thing that happened right before the First World War was, of course, the invention of psychology. So the invention that I have things inside me I need to think about. And then I have this huge trauma, this huge collective trauma, which is the war. And then we have this world that is now changing and that doesn't really fit with the nostalgic ideas I have. of this sort of, how do all of these bits fit together now that I've been told I need to figure out how these bits fit together. Yeah. But I also then know that there is different ways of interpreting the book, of reading into, well, what is this about? But to me, there was a very large sort of idea around the consequences of the First World War. In Asia, in the 1930s, we have a Korea that has yet gone through the Korean War, is not divided, and the author Yasang with Wings. This book was written when Korea was occupied. Japan, Korea was a colony of Japan during Yesang's life. And I don't know enough about history to know in what terms would be correct, but that's sort of what I was told. Talking about psychoanalysis, this is a book that has 3 short stories put into one, and they're pretty much just 3 stories that tell the same thing again and again and again. But he does it in a very brilliant way. The focus is that there is a man who clearly isn't comfortable or able to live in the Korean culture. There is something with him that is just, things just stop. He doesn't know how to act and interact, and the masculine role that he is supposed to play. And he meets a woman, and they fall in love. And because he is so passive, she ends up becoming a sex worker. And then she has, so she ends up being a sex worker, and this is clearly something that frustrates her for different reasons in different ways, and she has outbursts of anger. And in Norwegian, we have a term called himmelfallen, fallen from the sky, which talks about a feeling where you are so surprised by something happening that you become overwhelmed and unable to act. So it's a surprise that leads to passivity. And this could be a positive surprise, or it could be a negative surprise. But the important thing is that you're so shocked that you do not know how to act. And that was what was so interesting in the dynamics in his books, where this woman who is sort of pushed into prostitution for some reason, in some way, becomes angry, explodes, and he becomes himmelfallen. So he just stands there completely passive, and she's the woman like, poor you. Oh, poor dear. So it's a very sort of interesting take on how these women become this Madonna whore personality, perspective, where they're forced into both the prostitution, the whore role, but also the mother or the Madonna role, due to his passivity and due to his inability to cope, in a sense. So there sort of is a lot of psychosexual symbolism around being a man, about gender roles, and of course, the inability to understand how your sort of inability to act forces others to act in a way. Short book, but it packs a punch. And the last book that I read from the 1930s is Ngaio Marsh from New Zealand, who at this time was writing herself into history as one of the queens of crime, alongside, shortly getting the names, Marjorie Allingham, Dorothy L. Sayers, and of course Agatha Christie. And they were sort of a part of the golden age of detective books. And I have not read Allington or Sawyer, but I have read a lot of Agatha Christie. And what I found funny when I read the book, Murder with a White Tie, is that it's so similar to Agatha Christie, but so distinct as well. It's not like she is copying Agatha Christie or Agatha Christie is copying her, but so it's. I'm getting excited and need to get my words out. So it's a way of reading something that is clearly within a very specific cultural discourse, where a lot of what she is writing is recognizable tropes and a recognizable way of writing and a purpose of writing to Agatha Christie, but doing it in her very own way. So while Agatha Christie is very much focused on psychology and logic, Poirot illustrates that very well when he says he's using his little grey self. He is logically trying to figuring out based on psychology, while Ngaio Marsh is much more about psychology and the interpersonal drama. So I've only read one book of her. So when I'm only sort of interpreting one book, analyzing one book. But the book starts with the detective going into an upper class area and trying to figure out a blackmail situation. And I know that there will be a murder because it's called Murder with a White Tie. But we are so far into the book before the murder actually happens. So I almost forget that we are supposed to have a murder at some point, because it's just about the psychology around the blackmail and the drama around who is getting blackmailed and what are they getting blackmailed about. So she is absolutely her own voice. She is absolutely doing her own take on it, but so clearly writing within a discourse that was happening. And I really wanted to read the two others, Allington and Sayre, just to see if they also sort of are doing their own thing and in what way they're doing their own thing. So that was my journey through time. Have you read any of the books on the list? Are you doing the same? Readathon? Let me know. And thank you for listening to me screaming into the void.